So this is where it all started. More than 10 years ago, I decided to get an ancestry DNA kit to discover my genetic roots. And from that moment onwards, it started a decade-long research and discovery back to Africa. Not only had I discovered my roots, but for me, it was time to go further, and I stepped foot in Africa for the first time nearly 6 years ago. The experience was unbelievable. The air, the mountains, the sands, and the faces of people who looked just like me passing by with friendly smiles and gentle gazes as if I had long been a part of them, as if I had come back home. And to me, that's exactly what I did. I felt it in my bones and in my spirit, and I still do. Something about Africa, even through the hard times, just tells me that these were the roads that my ancestral mother walked upon. And who was she? Where did she go? What was she walking to do? These are the questions I wanted to answer. This is what I wanted to know. Ordinarily, most people would take a DNA test from a mainstream site and go with the results from there. And it's a great start. However, to really get an accurate idea, you have to go a bit deeper. But remember, the probability of you being able to trace your exact roots to a village, as was done with Alex Haley, is extremely rare. And I will explain why in just a moment. Most DNA tests predict the probability of relativity. They look at how similar you are to the people in a specific area. So the results you are getting cannot tell you you are from Sierra Leone, for example, but they tell you if you share 90% similarity to people from that area. So what does that mean? That means you are most likely related down the line to someone in that area. An Ethiopian sharing 90% or 100% similarity to Ethiopia, well, it would have been expected, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean he is only Ethiopian, so to speak. It means that the strongest part of his DNA is related or similar to the tribal people of that area. For us African Americans, it's complicated because one, geographical differences. Many of the African countries, quote unquote, and borders nowadays didn't exist at the time that we were taken. They were borders that were created, but during the first parts of the transatlantic slave trade, many of those regions had kingdoms instead. Secondly, much of our blood has been diluted. To find an African American with 90% or more of African ancestry is extremely great because they can most likely trace their roots much better than the average black person. Such a person's lineage has not been heavily diluted, and they share results also similar to an African. Unfortunately, as you may realize now from our previous episodes, that was not my case.
So the way I did it, I took 4 different DNA tests from 23andMe, Ancestry.com, African Ancestry, and DNA Heritage. I then sent the DNA results to 3 different geneticists and anthropologists to analyze the results per strand. To get a more accurate idea, since as a female the main results would be a reflection of mtDNA or maternal DNA, I encouraged my aunt and mother to do the same. As they are a generation before me, their results would give me an even better and accurate idea. Surprisingly, however, my mother's roots differed very greatly from my aunt's. Was that an indicator of some possible infidelity or something? Why would her results be so different? I searched and looked up genetics for a while to get my answer. No, it couldn't reveal infidelity because they had the same mother and the results read through the mother's line. However, different siblings can take strong parts of the genetics from different sides in different generations. Even twins may have varied genetics. Some take more dominant genes than others, but I couldn't necessarily discover whose DNA results were more dominant, not with my limited knowledge. So, however, it did explain why they could be sisters and get 2 different results. It was almost like piecing together a puzzle. It all went together. We just had to find the pieces, and they would reveal different parts which were dominant individually. So in fact, all of our results actually tells me not only which genes were more dominant in us, but also which other genes ran recessive through us. So I know you're waiting for the results, and here they are.
As you can see from the standard test, the results were pretty average. Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Senegal, Sudan, right? But here's what I discovered. My overall African ancestry was only about 67%, some averaging it out to 70%. It's not really a lot, and that saddened me. However, I did discover that nearly 90% of that DNA percentage was related to Fulani, Hausa, and some Yoruba roots, almost undifferent with every single analysis. Now that was something that's amazing. Remember that Nigeria we discovered? Well, here's what the anthropologists broke down in their results, and every single one of them discovered roots in the northernmost part of Nigeria, entering into Niger Sahara and spreading into it from the east, most strongly from Chad, also known as the Chad. So, what was that? This was a trail. We now had a point of travel from this woman. Most likely, she or her family traveled from the eastern sands of Africa into the west. Now, let's go back. If you recall from previous episodes, Carroll took many of his slaves from Ghana or the Gold Coast, yet many of them were not actually from Ghana. Even if Ghanaian roots were found, they were most likely mixed with other tribes and kingdoms from before their arrival in Ghana. Let's also look at the history during this time. The Ghanaian kingdom in Timbuktu was very vast and popular. Scholarships was very important during this time, and Africans were traveling from east and west to common meeting points in both the Ghanaian kingdom and Timbuktu. Africans were very mobile during this time, and it wasn't until the end of the 17th century, in the midst of slavery and colonization, that many Africans started to stay and hide away in specific places to avoid the imminent dangers. The end of the 18th century. However, in the 1600s and early 1700s, this was not the case. Now let's look at a few other points. The African DNA was also broken down in mainstream sites with possible timelines. Based on the details of the similar DNA and its quantity, they could discover how many generations this DNA went back. Interestingly, we could see the African DNA for generations even of our slave mothers. Here's what we found. The further back we went, the deeper we went into East Africa. I know you're probably thinking most civilizations supposedly started in East Africa, right? However, we are talking a bit more recent than that. So I don't mean the caveman era's like roots to East Africa, but a reality that during the kingdom of Aksum and after, we had roots during this time. However, if we had taken from Africa around the 1692, as the genealogy seems to allude to, and the East African DNA points to the 1600s, then that means that the first lady taken must have had family roots in Eastern Africa. She herself may have been biracial, but her mother was strongly from East Africa. Or she was from East Africa, taken in West Africa, and its later generations of slaves who had roots in West Africa. Either way, it reads that around 1600s, we were just as strongly East African as some of the present-day East Africans' great-grandfathers. Their nomadic roots and ours were undifferent, except for one fact. While their grandfathers possibly stayed in their countries, ours migrated. So where? Where in East Africa were they? Where did they go? My mother's East African DNA was actually the strongest of us all. While for us East Africa was the smallest percentage, for her it was the largest. It was quite fascinating considering when we were in Somaliland, most of the people unequivocally placed her as a Somali of some tribe. For me, they could usually assume I was mixed due to some various features. However, for her, they never even guessed it, and their guesses were actually right. After careful analytical research, we discovered that her East African DNA started in Ethiopian Somaliland, or possibly Harare, and moved into Sudan. Their DNA detected or traced roots that though moved into Sudan, were not ethnically Sudanese, they were ethnically Somali and Ethiopian. I had to do some deep research to discover migration of the people in that region. The Aksum Empire existed during that time, and before that, Harare was a center for Arabs after the coming of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. However, we had no Arab roots. Therefore, it's a possibility that they were related to the original Aksumites or Somali Ethiopians in that region, and they possibly had a village in that area, but they were also known to take care of camels and to migrate. The Ethiopian Empire and the Nubians and Sudanese had many interactions during this era of the 1600s. In fact, even Even the Africans will find themselves having so many genetic similarities between each other. Samburos and Maasai have Nubian roots themselves. Rendile in Kenya have Somali, Tutsi, and Bakara ancestral similarities. So for us to share them as African Americans actually isn't rare at all. Many people traveled along the Nile and to farms and villages around Nubia due to its lush green land and fruits before colonization and deforestation. That would explain my mother's East African DNA and why Ethiopia and Sudan was so strong. However, what about my ancestry? The Ethiopian and Sudanese was there, but my strongest DNA came generations later and stopped in northern Niger and Mali. By this time, the Sahara Desert had already started to spread in an issue called desertification, which affected the entire region. My DNA in the Sahel region was so strong they were able to find a village root in some areas around Niger. But as mentioned earlier, we can't claim or find these villages because many of the geographical changes affected migration. Most likely that family wouldn't be there anymore, or the village may not even exist and may have now been covered by the spreading desert. And even if that family does still frequent that area, it would be hard to locate them if they are nomads, as it appears. Sadly, this is one of the tragedies of slavery. We can even find our families, but actually reconnecting as though we are part of them is long gone. We won't find our ancestral mothers again, but for me, just knowing the path and regions they frequented is enough for me to feel the connection. Knowing the languages they may have spoke, the blood running through their veins makes me feel connected to even the people who may have spoke my ancestral mother's language. Knowing they were all of nomadic cultures tells me about my own nomadic inclinations, but also explains how they could have landed from Aksum, Ethiopia, to the Ghanaian Empire and forced into a world far away, a world of difference, of love, of possibilities, of carols and Annas, motherhood and strength. The last part of my research explained what our ancestral mother must have looked like based on all of our genetics. We knew her roots, her trail. Now who was she? All three of us shared the same genetic characteristics in our roots, therefore telling me that these genes had to have been quite dominant for us all. And it also meant our complexion, body shape, and hair texture was, contrary to popular beliefs, not as inherited from Europeans as much as we thought. Of course, European ancestry has some part in all of this, but it appears these women must have already looked a certain common way. Once again, it showed us per generation. In fact, as it drew closer to the Fulani Niger roots, the women's complexion became a lighter brown. Take a look at the results here. We see that they were a cinnamon complexion to a caramel, loose hair curls, figured bodies, and average height, prone to mosquito bites and allergies, which could be attributed to the constant migration, and possibly had a diet of a lot of meat and milk, which explains the nomadic culture. The women in East Africa were tall, slender, and cinnamon complexioned, or a bit darker, much like what we would find today and what I find in my mother, so that makes so much sense. It gives me chills how amazing genetics is and how we can carry it from generation to generation. We could very well be looking into the face of our ancestral mother because her genes were so strong. And for me, the women were a bit lighter with curlier hair, wavier hair, and a bit shorter, a bit curvier as well. And again, it makes so much sense. Even Africans themselves have easily placed me amongst Hausa Fulani people continuously. So, these women show so much resilience and the ability to bear and to continue their lineage, no matter the trials, the tribulations, and the rape and of their culture, of their lineage. Through childbirth, we were still able to carry their culture and their lineage through our blood hundreds of years later.
I hope one day to be able to travel the same routes my ancestral mothers traveled and discover the history, people, and cultures they must have encountered. I hope to be able to do this research for my Somali children's half roots as well. Through them, I could discover the deep Somali heritage running through their veins, but I could also see which parts of my DNA are also dominant in them. This journey has been so amazing and informative for me. I feel like in my blood I not only learn about myself, but also how we are a part of the history of Africa.
This journey has been so amazing and informative for me. I feel like in my blood I not only learn about myself, but also how we are a part of the history of Africa. We are the unification of Africa through our mixed DNA, the future of Africa, and a reminder of Africa's grand past. They may have taken us far away from our homes, families, kingdoms, but they could never take this out of us. In the womb of our ancestral mothers were so many possibilities, so many stories, and infants who carried on their African lineage and became us, people who have returned to our motherland. We may look different, we may speak differently, we may walk differently from the other Africans, but generations ago, our lineage intertwined with theirs, and our ancestors walked the same path right alongside theirs. And this is what this journey is all about.
Shut